Good morning.
Sorry.
This is a special meeting of the Budget Committee, and we're here to continue discussion and, hopefully also a vote on the proposed budget guidelines that everyone's been working on. So I would like to start out with a thank you to everyone on the Budget Committee that's been working on this, and in particular to Leslie Moriarty, who's been, amazing, as she always is on things like this, and to Nisha and Laura, too. But most importantly, to Roland Geiger, our budget director, and Pete Minarski. Roland provides continuing support, and Pete has also been instrumental in helping us get to this point and with data and information, and as a sounding board, and in particular to Dan Ozesmere, who's also been of great help to me in terms of looking at the numbers and everything. So we can't forget Ben Branyan, our town administrator, who's also provided information and support to all of us. So, thanks to all. And so I think we'll move ahead with this meeting, and I don't know if there's a motion to put forth the current budget guidelines that everyone's been working on since our last meeting, and to put that document as a discussion document. And
So moved.
is there a second to that
I'll
motion?
second it for discussion.
Okay, so you're seconding it for discussion?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Roland, we don't have the large format yet, but shall I just say in terms of our estimate, or do you want to talk about some of the changes we've had, or I'd be happy to do that? So since our last meeting, we've continued discussions. One of the changes that we've had is an increase in inflation rate. I think our colleagues have suggested an inflation rate of 2.4%, and I think we have in this budget guidelines 2.3, which is very similar to, our contractual rates for fiscal year '24 for our union colleagues, with the exception of the teachers' union, GEA, which is not yet approved by the RTM, but we have budgeted at 4.36%. In addition, we have increased the challenge to address this differential of 30 basis points, so another 300,000 plus or minus, and that brings the challenge to a total of $4.4 million. We've done this based on a formula in terms of basically our union rates primarily, and also a reduction in the, we'll call it inflation rate. So this is a challenge, and it's in no particular area, whether it's to figure out what can we do to continue to grow our government, deliver the excellent services, the high-quality services that are being delivered, but still looking at some restrained costs. There have been no changes in fixed charges. In terms of capital, we've agreed that rather than a $95 million number for capital, to increase that to $100 million. And our colleagues suggested that we have a capital tax levy of $1 million. We've agreed, or we've suggested that it be increased to 1.5, which I think we will need as we continue to grow our capital. And then that reduces borrowings ever so slightly. And that, at least as we are today, which is strictly informational, it's not what we're approving, that comes at much, much later date, but putting all these things together, the proposed mill rate at this point in time would be 2.99. Unlike other budgets that we've had in the past, there is probably less likelihood for any reduction in the mill rate and more risk that overall our costs are going to increase. Our utilities are volatile, and we can't, we're doing the best in our buildings and with our purchasing head and others involved to reduce these costs, but nevertheless, we are all facing it at home. So it's very similar to here in the town, and we will do what we can to constrain these costs. And that's probably one opportunity for some upside, but I don't know whether optimistically. So I think that's an overview. Laura?
Can I just ask a point of clarification on what do we mean by utilities? Are we also including fuel for autos, or are we just including?
Yes,
We are.
it includes, gas for, where we heat by gas, electricity. It includes fuel for autos. Currently, we've purchased that forward, I think, 160,000 gallons, as I understand, 80,000 in the town and 80,000 in the schools, because we used to purchase fuel for the busing company, which now is included in the contract, as I understand. Yes, those are all the utilities are there, including gasoline, if that's your question. So I've just sort of given an overview. I don't know if there are any comments that we'd like to have, or, I think this budget guidelines, I have to acknowledge all the work that's been done by everyone, and it's been a struggle for all of us. It started with working with Roland, probably around the middle of August, on some of these things, which I think is probably earlier than normal. But it's not going to be an easy year. I think fiscal year '24 is expected to be the first of several difficult years for the town of Greenwich budget. And, as we know, the capital spending and inflation is above whatever. And, we have a record capital in here because that is what we need to do for maintenance and to continue to support the reconstruction of Central Middle School, and obviously continue the remediation at GHS. So, anyway. Leslie?
So, and at our last meeting, when we discussed the budget guidelines, I made a number of comments showing concerns in the way the draft was previously included. So let me address those now, because I think I know some of those have been changed. So first, on the comments in the text on consolidation of core services, where the prior draft mandated that a core service be consolidated by the end of fiscal '24, the text now has been changed to identify a potential opportunity and the reason for that consolidation, whether it's going to be an issue of control or cost savings or whatever the possible benefit might be prior to moving forward with it. And so I think that's an improvement to the guidelines. Secondly, on the Board of Ed facilities, the prior draft mandated an approved plan by February for addressing school facilities and utilization. The language in the current version has been changed such that it asks for a facility utilization study, which is the first step that would be needed in determining whether a facility, a school could be closed, if that's the appropriate manner. So it puts the discussion more in the order in which the decision should be reviewed, and I think that's an improvement. the special education comments about Board of Education, where it tried to tie increased expenses over the past, past few years to a negative or a lowering costs in the next year's Board of Education budget. The language there has been changed to be more reflective of what we've been told, that it's more of a medium, longer-term kind of strategy, that we're not going to see the benefits of those investments and those expenses so quickly. So that text has been changed to ask for an update, to understand the issue better, but not to directly expect the benefit. In the issue of the operating expenses. So then there were two other key issues which I talked about. One is a methodology and just having a challenged budget. Is it really a requirement for a lower budget, or is it something for a discussion topic? That one is still concerning for me. It doesn't use the word requirement, but it sort of says it's a requirement because that's the targeted guidelines. And we know this board in the past, when there's the word guideline is used, it's often used as a cap, which has been a problem in some prior budgets. And I understand that the level of inflation we have and the upward pressure we have on town department expenses, and while that does relate to a property tax level, and no one wants their property taxes to increase period, or increase more than they need to at a minimum. I think it's an area where we have the responsibility to understand what the real impact is on services. And I know this board has tried in the past to get that information, to see where we might be able to improve delivery of services for a lower cost option. Our board clearly is focused on the cost of delivering services, but we also have the responsibility to make sure the service levels that our residents expect are met with the budgets that we approve. And I think that the challenge number, I really wonder whether the whole methodology of requiring budgets to be submitted at that lower level is what we really need to do this year, first of all. Secondly, the Board of Ed budget is asked to be reduced at a higher percentage than the rest of the town departments' budgets being reduced. The Board of Ed's budget is being reduced 1.5% from I'd say a continuation budget, but I'll have some comments about that word continuation in a minute. But at 1.5%, and the town is at 1.2%. Those are big numbers when it comes to their budgets. I think the rationale is because the Board of Ed employees are higher paid employees. There's more certified staff there, and therefore, to get the real benefit at the bottom line, you need to have a higher percentage on the Board of Ed. But when I look back at our budget approvals for the past 3 years, the Board of Ed budget has been consistently underfunded. We start with the COVID year where budgets were held flat, and so therefore the fact that their salaries increase on average 4% more because they have steps and they have many of their staff members who are not at the top step yet, were more negatively impacted than the rest of the town. Then we go to the following year where special ed out-of-district tuition was increasing by probably $1 million a year, and that wasn't funded in the budget. And then we look at last year's budget where transportation cost increased 12% year over year, and the special ed out-of-district tuition also increased another $500,000, I believe is the number, and that wasn't funded in the budget. So they're starting from a more compromised level. We also know the special ed program is increasing costs in order to address issues in the delivery of the service in the past. So we have handicapped the Board of Ed to some degree in our previous budgets, and then we're doing it again this year and penalizing them again more than the town. So I have that concern. The base consolidation budget or the continuation budget or level services budget or the rollover budget, however it's want to be called, the way that it's been devised is an aggressive budget in and of itself. You did identify that inflation was increased from 2% to 2.3% for the non-salary lines. But we know that inflation, and it's over budget, but the budget was prepared before we knew inflation was going to start. So it's a double year effect of rising inflation on costs. And so I think even the starting point would have been a challenge to all of our town departments. And so it further handicaps both the Board of Ed as well as the town departments. Moving to capital, which was a major point of concern that I had before, the $100 million, or the $95 million number, $100 million number, I'm still concerned at that number. Central Middle School is referenced in here at 67.5. I don't think, it's still too early to know what the expense is. I believe the Board of Education has identified the number to be, that they're going to put in the budget at 85 million, and that's based on responses to RFPs, but they have not yet voted at that level.
I'm sorry, what was that number?
85.
Thank you.
So if that does turn out to be the number they believe most appropriately addresses the ed spec scope that's been approved, to stick to that $100 million number clearly would be tough. We would not be doing basic maintenance, which I think as a board, we've committed to trying to continue to do basic maintenance. Secondly, the capital tax levy at an increase of 1.5 million, and I do appreciate that it moved up from a flat, no change in the capital tax levy to more. That capital tax levy is reflective of the future spending and the paybacks we'll have, and we haven't really, we will need to do a better analysis of that during our February meetings and really focus a little bit on capital and that capital plan and the financing of that capital plan. But in the interim, I would have expected us to go back to our traditional $3 million increase at this point in time, because we don't have more information to know that that's too much or what level of capital that really funds. The guidelines aren't expected to be a full estimate of what we're going to approve come February and March, because we have a lot of information to learn. And then the last issue I had a problem with was the 5-year capital number, which is in the document. I know the Office of the First Selectman has requested some guidance on how to address that, because if this year's capital is constrained, does the BET expect all of those projects that are being deferred and kicked down the road to be in next year's budget or the year after? And by putting a number in here of 400 million, we're saying, again, that number is not backed up, or it's not discussed in these guidelines of how it was derived. I think that's a very unrealistic number, given what's on the docket for us to look at. I mean, basically, I think people are saying could be no funding for Old Greenwich School. Hamel Rink doesn't happen. We are not buying another fire truck for 5 years. There's clearly no Northwest Fire Station. We paid for a field study to improve our playing fields, so there's no improvement in our playing fields. Sound Beach Fire Station, which is within that period, would not get rehabilitated. Fleet expense, we're not going to be replacing our vehicles as we expect, so maybe our maintenance cost increases. I think Western Middle School we're committed to doing, but that 12 million that they're estimating takes a big bite out of what we're looking at. So I think that there are a lot of implications with putting that number in there, and I don't agree that that's the right number, and I think there needs to be more deliberation over what that should be and whether we really are in a position to understand that. Is that a number based on what we think policy-wise needs to be done, or is that what this board believes we can finance, and then what's the assumption with the financing? I think I'll stop there. Those are the concerns I have. I appreciate that we were able to work together to address some of the concerns that were in the text, and we did make improvement in those areas, but some of the basic, the key areas on the numbers still are, I've got issues with. Thank you.
So, just a few comments on those. The challenge doesn't necessarily have to come out of the operations that you're talking about, but it needs, clearly, it expects the leadership of both the town and the Board of Education, schools, administration, to find areas for improvement, consolidation, reduction of costs. I mean, as an example, currently in this year's budget, which is down from previous years, but may not be by the time we get to the budget, we're funding Nathaniel Witherall to $1,750,000, which may not be our final number there. There's ways to look at this, and yet when you look at the town challenge, it's actually less than that. Likewise, I think you were very constructive in terms of identifying, a school utilization plan as a good first step at looking at reducing costs. So, I commend you for that. We need to look at those kind of things in terms of capital. As you know, and in here, we have, $170 million of open capital projects to complete. What's critically important to all of us is that the ARP ESSER projects be identified and prioritized and move those forward, because I don't think the town wants to return any of this money to the U.S. government. So there's a tremendous amount of work to be done by all to move forward. I think in terms of the capital tax levy, we all recognize that this larger capital budget will require additional capital tax levy to fund it. But we also know that seems to be a slowdown in the work. We know that the debt issuance for the town is basically going to be flat to the current year. We normally issue around January. So in the next 2 Januaries of 2023 and 2024, that'll be flat. So while I agree that we need to anticipate this for the future, we've also, in the previous version, documented the resources that we have addressed and that are impacting and perhaps lessening the need for capital tax levy as such. But we recognize, and I think even increased what your suggestion was for the capital tax levy, and I think we increased that number by an additional 50% because we do realize we need to move ahead. In terms of the 5-year capital number, you've probably had more input into that to date than I have. But my own personal regard to this is that this is beyond the scope of the Budget Committee, but you have pointed out, and I think, our chair and so forth, that this is critically important to structuring this for Selectman's office. And also, as you point out, we need to know this number so we can do our debt planning. Whether this is the right number, I don't know whether $400 million is the right number, but what it is it provides a guidance to our town administrator at this point in time to begin to prioritize the projects. And I think it's an excellent start, and it may actually be an aggressive number considering everything that we have on the table. And as for your pointing out all these other projects that are out there, yes, they're out there, but we have moved other major projects ahead with the spending of substantially less capital than we're projecting now. And so, we're projecting that the other, 4 years, it probably, we'll say around $80 million per year after $100 million this year. We'll see if the town can keep to that schedule. I just, again, I don't have much input to the 5-year number because, quite frankly, as has been the custom, and I'll say also workload of this Budget Committee, we're having a tough enough time doing 1 years and 2 years, let alone 5 years. So, I just, some quick comments. But we appreciate your help in terms of, everyone's help in terms of the agreements and where we've landed today, so far. So thank you very much. Nisha?
I have a comment, but Laura, do you want to go first?
Oh, Laura? I'm sorry, Laura, I looked and then you didn't even.
Okay, all right, so I just want to make some observations on the Board of Ed, both operating and capital budgets, just specifically focusing on the comments Ms. Moriarty made on, that the board, we have, the increase on the Board of Ed year on year, percentage-wise is, or the cut that we're requesting is perhaps larger than the town. So I just want to state some facts, from in the last 4 or 5 years, which is the period that we're looking at for these guidelines, our town population has kind of been about flat, right? So plus minus a few percentage points. So during that same, our town budget accordingly has reflected that. On the school side, our enrollment over the last 4 years, and I'm looking at that time period because specifically that's what's referenced in this budget guideline, but the general trend has been declining. So our school population over the last 4 years is somewhere around 6%. Our elementary schools are down 15%, roughly around 500 students. And during that same time period, our BOE budget has increased somewhere between 15 and 20%, depending on if you factor in benefits. So I do think it's a fair expectation that, our budget be tied really, either you can look at it cost per resident when you look at it from the town side, or you can look at cost per student, which is the appropriate metric. So I do think we need to help the Board of Ed figure out how to get their numbers to be more in line and more, run their programs more efficiently. It's hard, cuts are always difficult, but we need to figure out a way that our cost per student stay in line with both state averages. And again, we also have to have accountability. So if we are going to fund our schools and have our cost per students be higher than anywhere around the state or anywhere referenced to our district, we also have to expect deliverable, considerable and significant performance. So that's a comment I'll make on the operating side. I'm sure we can get into more details, but broadly, we've observed a decline of 7% in our school population during this time period and an increase of 15 to 20% of our school budget. And we need to figure out how to help the Board of Ed get these numbers in check. Second, I'll talk about capital. There's lots of projects, but I'll focus on Central Middle. I'm also the BET liaison on the CMS Building Committee, so I can speak very much in detail as to where we are in terms of the costing on that. We're right now deciding the owner's rep and we'll soon decide the architect. And you're correct, the architect right now has the range of estimates are coming in significantly higher than what the BET has proposed. That being said, I think it's important to note that the scope of the current Central Middle project is considerably larger than either what the state requires or what the BET would have liked to have seen. Now, unfortunately, just the way our town is structured, the way the interaction between our two bodies has happened, the BET has not been invited to these discussions with the Board of Ed. And you can say, well, you're a different body. The Board of Ed should, and these are discussions we've had. I've heard Board of Ed members say this as well. This is our purview to decide what the ed specs should look like. And I think that's great, and I think that's appropriate. But I think we do have to keep the budget with a line of budget, and that's where we come in. So it would have been nice if we were invited to those discussions for ed specs so we could advise where we think the budget should be. But I'll share what the numbers, what the state thinks the size of the school should be and what the cost of the school should be. And I'll discuss what the Board of Ed thinks this number should be. So we haven't had a check on these numbers, either in terms of scope of the project or the budget of the project. This is the first time we're getting a look at it. But so the maximum enrollment for Central Middle over the next 8 years is somewhere around 500 students, 511 students is what's officially on the records, but we can say somewhere around 500. The school is being built for 660 students. That's 30% larger than the maximum predicted enrollment over the next eight years, which is, again, how the state looks at it. In terms of state guidelines, the state also provides some guidance on how large should we build schools when we have these opportunities. And the state says, you should do a $1 per square foot calculation depending on if it's elementary, middle, or high. For middle schools, it's actually the highest dollar per square foot, or highest square foot per student. It's somewhere around 150 square feet per student. So if you take the 150 square feet multiplied by 500, you get somewhere around 75 to 80,000 square feet. That's the size of the school the state thinks we should be building. We are building somewhere around 115 to 120,000 square feet. So we are building a school, whether we look at it in terms of enrollment, 30% larger, or in terms of what the state guideline predicts, 40% larger. So the idea that our budget is coming in 20 to 30% over BET guidelines is not surprising. When you build larger, it costs more. So this, I think at this point, we should be sending very clear signals to the building committee or to the Board of Ed that this scope of this project is larger than it needs to be. It's not fair to the parents of the school because this project is going to get delayed, or it's not fair to the residents, our town residents, when we think about all of our other infrastructure projects that perhaps will be compromised if the budget of this project goes over. So we need to be very mindful and also understand this is the only opportunity we have to be a check on the costing of our infrastructure projects, whether it's the Board of Ed or any other town. I'm happy to go into details about CMS, but I do think that we have a good handle on, the building committee has a good handle and good interest from both owners, reps, and architects and construction managers, and we can get this school built in budget, but we need to get the project in scope with what we believe is appropriate.
Thank you, Nisha. Laura, did you have comments?
Well, I don't know how we want to, I could offer a couple general comments, and then I would like to go to the text and just offer specific comments or ask specific questions. And I recognize it's difficult because what's posted is not the draft that we have before us.
Right.
But I think we might want to clarify that assuming we act today, this is on the agenda for the full BET tonight, and the document that we ultimately arrive at will be posted. Is that your assumption
That would be
for
correct.
the public, whoever's watching?
That would definitely be correct.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to echo.
I mean, again, I look at our chair, but he has a thumbs up. So yes, that is definitely correct.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is part of the sausage making. There was a lot of dialogue and drafts over the weekend, so just so the public who might rightfully be confused, hopefully this will all be sorted out. I want to echo Ms. Moriarty's comments earlier that we do appreciate some of the movement in recognizing a higher inflation assumption and increasing the capital tax levy by $1.5 million. The outcome is a slightly higher than the draft that is shown, 2.6 increase in the mill rate to 2.99%. The result of which, of course, is it drives the challenge figure higher. So the town is expected to show cost savings of $1.6 million. The BOE is expected to show cost savings of $2.8 million, which is indeed a challenge. If we look at the draft, and I'm listening, and I do appreciate Ms. Aurora's comments, because to be perfectly blunt, now is the time for honesty. And when I look at the top of page 2,
Page 2.
so if this is a discussion about Central Middle School, and I did want to ask what this language meant. And Ms. Aurora has expressed her view as the BET liaison on the building committee, which is that the $67.5 million is the budget, and the scope should be commensurate with the budget, if I understood the flavor of those comments correctly.
No, I actually, Laura, I think it's interesting. I'm glad you pointed that out because this number, if you recall, this number, we did ask the Board of Ed how did we arrive at the $60 million number. I think we've added in $2.5 million for architect and $2.5 million for other points. And at that point, I do remember when we had the Board of Ed, the superintendent with us, she said they're going to use a back of the envelope calculation of a 100,000 square foot school at $600 a square feet. And that's how we came up with the $60 million construction, and then we added in additional. But that number was very back of the envelope, and it did assume that we were going to build a school larger than the footprint of what existed today. So it's not that this number is the number that we've provided. This is the number that they came to us with and said, this is the budget we think the school construction will cost. I actually, if you remember, had a discussion of why 600, why not something different or, whatever, but we agreed, this is the number. So now this is the budget that the BET has defined for this particular project and what we think is an appropriate number. I think this is also very generous, to be quite frank, in relation to what size and scope of this project should be. That being said, once the Board of Ed built their ed specs, they did not build with this number in mind. They built with a kind of, in some sense, a wish list of what we think, how large, what we want this, where we think this enrollment of this school could go, what the size of the school we would like to have. And that, I think there's something lost in translation there. I don't think they ever wore a budget hat when the ed specs were completed. I don't think the firm that did the ed specs ever were given a budget of what the school should look like, and I think that's an appropriate way. So when you hire an architect for your house, you say, this is my budget, build within this budget. That discussion appears to not ever happen at the Board of Ed level.
So I think you just answered the question, that this budget envisions, this challenge budget envisions a smaller scope of the Central Middle School project based on this budgeted figure.
I'm not sure I would use the word smaller scope. I think that is the scope that, this 67 million, again, I think it's 60 million was the number that was requested by the Board of Ed, was for the actual construction, was based upon, not a challenge, based upon a 100,000 square foot school, which is considerably larger than what is the current footprint or what was, would be defined by an appropriate enrollment number. So I don't see this as a challenge at all. I see this as a very appropriately sized project.
Okay. All right, so I'm struggling with the language because we've heard in public session, the BOE is scheduled to vote on Thursday, that their intent is to average the cost estimated by the architects submitting proposals and come up with a number, which it appears, it sounds like it may be north of 67.5 million.
Yep.
And I, as a BET member, the ed specs are the purview of the Board of Ed. There was input with an outside firm. There was input from the school community. The BOE voted on these ed specs. And if we're saying, and I don't want to repeat the mistakes, or I don't want to say mistakes, but what transpired with JC, because that was 3 years of delay. And so I just want to be very clear what this body's message is with Central. Are we saying you are capped at this project cost, you should be able to make it work? Or are we saying there's additional room based on new information about the cost of your project? And I'm just trying to answer that very basic question.
So I'm going to step in here before Nisha responds, because Nisha is the person who should respond. But you talk about a data available or, the ed specs and whatever. I then ask the question, why, if the Board of Education has requested 3 separate enrollment studies, their, long-range capital plan, their, original Prouder study, I'll pronounce his name, for the entire student population, the more recent Prouder study, which was enrollment study done by the Board of Education's person, dated around, I'll say, April 1 of 2022, after the Budget Committee had met and prior to the preparation of the ed specs. And that particular study showed the continuing declining enrollment at Central Middle School. And by the way, it had all the feeder elementary schools in there too. It wasn't just doing Central Middle School standalone. And that study showed that, why you started 511, whatever the number is, it's a declining enrollment. And over the next decade, the average enrollment is 453 students. And that number in that period of time actually goes down into the high 300s. So the previous Prouder study showed more than one middle school with declining enrollment. So, you point out one thing, but then I would ask you, why would a Board of Education commission a study and that it not be, as public perhaps as it should have been? And why wasn't it taken into consideration for this particular, study? Do we plan to close another middle school? What is the plan here? I think that there are issues here, Laura, that do need to be addressed. And, you're a data person the way I am, Leslie, Nisha are. Why was this data ignored? And does it make sense to continue on this route when our data doesn't support a school this large? Why would a school be built for 660 students when, their own data shows average enrollment over the next decade of 453. I don't know the answer to that question, but, I just want to make sure that when we look at data, that we're looking at all the data.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think you've answered the question about how I should be looking at how these budget guidelines are presenting the Central Middle School project. I don't want to speak for the Board of Ed, but I do know, having listened to some of the meetings, as I know others do on the BET, they've had this discussion. There was a discussion about the trade-offs for the common spaces. There was a discussion of, new requirements for breakout spaces and appropriate suitable spaces for delivering special ed services. There was a discussion about maybe using Central as a possible avenue to relieve some of the pressure on Eastern, which is pretty overcrowded and has been for a long time. And then there was a discussion that, looking back 20 years, since we're building the school for 70 years, lifespan, hopefully, maybe we need to be looking at historical trends, not just the next 10 years, because remember, these kids haven't been born yet. So I don't want to put ourselves in the Board of Ed, but I'm hearing that the appetite is 67.5 million, to be honest.
I think that, we all recognize construction costs or, supply chain issues, but, what is the most reasonable school for all? I think that discussion, needs to continue. And I don't mean to step in here between, Nisha and you, and I allow the dialogue to continue, but I think we have to be, cognizant. I mean, I ask you then, what is the operating cost per square foot of operating a school? Once you consider the utilities, which you were discussing earlier, once you consider the number of janitors that are needed for a larger school, for the janitorial materials and your traditional operating costs for a school, that all needs to be taken into perspective. Have they budgeted that into their future budgets? If they want a school this large, what is the overall future impact on their operating costs? I think these things need to be considered too. And quite frankly, a standalone group like this needs more input and support systems, in my opinion, as we would do in the private sector, from financial support and looking forward to what it's going to cost them. You talk about the operating budget, and Leslie talked about it, but, I want to point out that, when you consider the benefits on our estimate here, incorporated as after the challenge and still with the benefits, the town budget goes up 3.12%, and the school's budget is going up 3.47%. And that school's budget is going up without their largest pay group, the teachers, having any kind of, teachers' pension fund costs in those numbers. So, where are we headed on all of this, and how will this, building this larger building that wasn't anticipated, that wasn't requested by our superintendent when she came and discussed this with the budget committee in February and March, I think both. And so, these are questions that I can't answer in this, but I think we can all work together to understand what are the real estimated project costs. And Leslie has pointed this out, and I'm going to bring it up. When we give these projects over to a building committee, there is no direct reporting line to anyone. And so we have to, there's a responsibility on the front end that we all make sure that any project, and I mean every single building committee, is headed in the right direction. And at the moment, I think we're going to have, how many building committees operative, Leslie? We've got the vestibule, we've got CMS, we've got 4 now, and I think the BOE has requested a 5th, correct, with the Western. Is that correct? I think that's correct.
I think so.
So, I think we have to consider these things too. So anyway, I know you were having a dialogue this way, which I will continue, but I did want to step in and add a couple of these points.
Okay, I have another question, clarification on page 3 of 6.
Nisha has her hand up. Can I ask her if it's
sure.
on that point? If it is?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Laura. So, two things, one, this point has come up, it also came up on the building committee, it's come up several times on this board, that, the Board of Ed is responsible for the ed specs. We shouldn't, the BET should kind of be in its lane, let them be in their lane. I'm happy I'm happy to not get in the lane of sizing of classrooms and the sizing of schools. I don't want to be in that business, but we are the fiduciaries and we are responsible for defining a budget for this project. So we need to figure out what is that tolerance level. If the school's enrollment is set to be somewhere around 500 and the Board of Ed came to us and said, hey, we want to build a school for 1,000 kids. We want to build 200,000 square feet. That's what they're doing up in Norwalk. Would we say, hey, that's fine because the Board of Ed wants and that's what they think is responsible? And by the way, I think it's the same discussion whether it's the Board of Ed or the town. If the Civic Center came to us and said, we want to build the Eastern Greenwich 200,000 square feet, we'd say, hey, how many residents are you serving in Eastern Greenwich and does this appropriate? And it's not, listen, if they had come to us and said, this project is being built for 5%, 10% cushion over what we think the maximum enrollment should be, we can all, put our reasonable due diligence hats on. But when the numbers are 30 to 40% larger, that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about a rounding error. When they're proposing projects that are 30 to 40% larger than either what their own enrollment studies show or what the state guidelines show, then we have to step in and say, listen, guys, the budget is going to blow up, right? And I would have this discussion, even if this project were within budget, I would make that same comment. This is not just about staying within our lane or not. We have to help. That's our responsibility that we have, that we need to make sure that we push back and say, listen, appropriately size these projects. And the second point I'll make is on enrollment. And this is not a cyclical trend, and this is another comment I've heard, enrollment goes down, enrollment goes up. That's kind of we have to look at historical trends of what was going on 50 years ago. There is a secular trend of declining enrollment, not just in our state, across the country. And that's due to, women having children later, women have less children. That is not something that is unique to our town or our state. We need to plan for it. So this idea that we're going to go back and have larger enrollment, that's what we need to build for. Maybe 50 years from now, we'll go back to those numbers. One, none of the data shows that, none of the economists agree with that assessment. So we cannot, that's an argument I've heard over and over again in this committee and on our building committees. And the point I really want to make is I don't think it is our responsibility as finance board members to be here to say, well, we do not have a say in other departments, whether it's the Board of Ed or it's Public Works. We absolutely have a responsibility to raise our hand and point out, listen, guys, these things are getting either out of scope, out of budget, whatever. That is the responsibility we have and what we have been elected to do. We should not be here to lobby for any particular department or group.
Weigh in on the same
No,
discussion?
is this the same point?
Discussion.
Yes.
So there's, a lot of information has been just identified at this meeting, and I think we clearly have a process problem, and I don't want us to ignore it. I don't want that the building committee has a responsibility to implement the ed specs that have been approved, and if this board a year from now or 5 months from now is going to say we're not approving the scope of that work, then that needs to be addressed right away. I think there's a lot of assumptions which have been stated at this table, which I disagree with, which is why there needs to be a conversation about it. To talk about the enrollment, and everybody is looking at a different set of data, not looking at all the issues. Things have been identified about Eastern being overcrowded and the impact on Central, whether this enrollment trend is cyclical or not, what should be the right size. Is a discussion that needs to have. I don't want members of this board just to go out and say, well, I believe this set of numbers, and therefore my set of numbers are going to drive what a dollar amount I believe needs to be there. There needs to be a real sharing discussion of that information. Same thing with costs. Costs are tied to the program. I'm not sure we've ever built a building that matches the state standard of reimbursement. That reimbursement number is not intended to be a fully allocated number for building in Fairfield County of everything we would want our middle school to be. Does it match everything our program needs to deliver? Does it match the mix of the needs of our kids? I don't know the answers to those questions. I do expect that when the ed specs were developed, they looked at what schools need, what schools, appropriate schools looking forward, looking for the next 10, 20 years of what the trends are in education can deliver. And I think our kids deserve that kind of building. And so whether that building meets what the state reimbursement rate is a question. My guess is I doubt that, and I doubt it reflects what's in Fairfield County. So I don't think that should be the standard, but we should understand that, right? And currently, our process is, you're right, do not have a point of contact, really, between the decision that the Board of Ed made and our financing. And I would not want the discussion to be delayed until they come in when the building committee has wasted effort with an architect, sending them, go build this, if this committee has no intention of funding that. Or I should say, the majority members of this committee have no intention of funding that. Thank you.
So, I'm
Just,
sorry, do you
can I-
want to,
Really quickly.
the same topic?
Just on this topic, really quickly. So I just want to I want to clarify that I'm using the state guidelines not to evaluate the reimbursement. I think for this particular Central Middle project, the state guidelines are advising that we build a school somewhere around $30 million. So the reimbursement is going to be somewhere between $3 and $4 million. I'm not talking about that. I already realized this project is going to be way beyond that based upon state guidelines. But we do need to understand those guidelines are there in place for a specific reason. They're there to give you some level of guidance. So if the state thinks we should be building something for $35 million and we want to build for $100 million, there's a disconnect. I'm not saying we can't build a little bit bigger or a little bit nicer or a little bit more to our needs, but there needs to be some materiality to it being, if we're going to go a little bit larger. And then I had one more point, which I lost, but I'll come back to it, because,
Laura, you can continue.
I'm ready to move on from Central. If
Yeah, we're moving on.
Wanisha, if she remembers the point, we'll happily go back to it. So I just wanted, on top of page 3, the BOE facilities, I just wanted to be sure we're using common numbers. I crunched some numbers, turns out Roland had crunched some numbers. But let's just be very clear about this. There's a statement in here that talks about pre-K through 12, declining enrollment by 525 students. I think we're pretty close there, although the source is not the 9/8/22 enrollment report, because that is only a snapshot. It has no historical data. So let's remove that citation or just add per enrollment reports.
I'm sorry, you're going to want to remove the what?
The parenthetical after the 525 students says per the 9/8/2022 enrollment report.
Okay.
That report is just a snapshot. It does not show any historical data, so that's not the right citation. So either we should remove it or cite enrollment reports.
But I think we can remove it if you're happy, because we.
I'm
give
happy
you
to
all the
remove it.
data.
I mean, maybe it makes sense to share this as an exhibit. We talk about K-5 declining 14%. I have a different number. And if you include so I have K-5 declining about 8.4%. If you include pre-K, it's 7.5%. So I just want to get the numbers right. And we can do this offline. We don't have to spend time. But Roland and I have the exact same numbers. So I think it's just a computation issue. Anecdotally,
So can, just offline, how do you want to?
Well, just,
Well,
I think it should be a pre-K through 5 number, because that's what drives facility needs.
well, that's what I would say too. So the decline from the 10/18/2018 enrollment report to the September 8th, 2022 enrollment report, pre-K through 5, is a decline of 316 students.
well, we don't, just to be clarified, we don't, as a town, pre-K is not offered across, like, we have certain openings that we have, but it's not, we don't have a universal pre-K per se in town of Grady. It is a mandated program, and I do understand, but the reason I think it's important to look at K to 5, especially when we're looking at budget and dollar per student, we're spending $26,000, $27,000 per student on average, a little bit more on some of these elementary programs. If we include the pre-K numbers, the numbers get very skewed very quickly, because I don't think we're spending $27,000 on pre-K. So it's K to 5 is more appropriate from a budget standpoint. I understand we can look at enrollment. I did get 14% from K to 5, but we can take this offline and get the numbers
Right,
intact.
so let's do that. But I mean, I do think the important point is on a facilities utilization, the pre-Ks, the number of sections is driven by it's a special ed delivered or mandated program. And so it's driven by a mandate, but the actual sections are placed in schools that have additional capacity. So it does impact the facilities utilization report. So I think we just need to tie out our numbers and again, maybe show our work as an exhibit. I also want to add that on the statement that says declining enrollment is a trend being observed across the country. I'm not disputing that statement, but it'd be nice to cite a source in case people would like to look at that. Maybe it's different regionally or what have you. The next sentence, we have 11 elementary schools, 3 middle schools, and 1 high school. I think we need to add that we have an alternative high school as well, so that's an additional space. That's it for my specific questions. I do want to, the point about the 5-year capital forecast, which is page 5 of 6, the first full bullet on that page. So that $400 million figure includes $100 million, to clarify, includes $100 million for fiscal '24, correct, Leslie? So the next 4 years would be $75 million if you just do the straight math. And I'm not sure how we're taking into account projects that are reimbursable. I know we have a lot of bridge projects, a lot of LOTSIP projects. I'm not sure how we're taking into account projects that may have a source of private donation. So I want to be really, really clear when we're asking people to forecast over the next 5 years, you know, what should stay in, even if it might exceed the number because there's an extenuating circumstance, right?
So Laura, I think your points on that last, your last point here on the 5-year capital forecast are fair points to ask. You know, I think that Leslie, I think, has raised similar questions. And maybe, you know, there's a final sentence. It says, it is recognized that future capital goals may vary. Maybe we need to add that in this number, we expect our process to be refined on how we compute this number, you know, by the time the budget, you know, deliberations are complete, you know, something like this, because I think the points you're bringing up are very valid points. It's just like some of the other things that we have before us, all these building committees being formed, and yet we've approved single appropriations and handing everything over to a building committee without the normal controls we have and processes. I think these are things that we could be very, very busy between now and, you know, budget deliberations in February. But I think my own opinion is that the questions that you're bringing up are, you know, we just haven't spent the time on this. You know, again, you know, I look at
We've got time.
I look at the charter and, you know, my own opinion is that some of this should be generated outside of us, but Leslie thinks, you know, and I agree with her, because of debt and so forth, we need to be very much involved. So I will support it, but I do think that there are clarifications needed, and so, you know, I agree with you on that point.
And likewise, not for today, not for guidelines, but, you know, we cite the Open Capital Report as of October 3rd. And as you and I both know from being liaisons to Department of Public Works, we know there are some projects that are overstated, right? We know that there's the Davis Ave Bridge. We can return some of that money. We know the Binney Park dredging. We know we can return most of that money. We just need a small amount for retainage. That's $3 million right there. So those numbers, while I appreciate it as a factor to forecast future capital capacity, we also need to really scrub those numbers and say, okay, what's the real number, right?
And I agree with you. And this is where we need to look to the departments to help us more. I mean, I've asked for, you know, interim progress reports on, you know, bridge funding or something, but we're not getting that kind of information. But I would just sort of, you know, add to your comments there that it also goes the other way. We know that the Glenville project is greatly exceeding our, you know, budget on that front. We know that Greenwich High School will continue and perhaps next year require more budgeted funds, and I think that these are the kind of things that will be hopefully greatly refined by the time we get to budget guidelines. But in order to greatly refine them, by the time we get to, budget guidelines, budget department meetings, we're all going to have to work together. The liaisons are going to really have to get out there and work and help us. Our other committees, HR and so forth and so on, they need to look at these guidelines and say, how can I anticipate some of these things and get some of this work done in advance? I think there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a tremendous, as this budget grows and our flat organization seems to be getting flatter and flatter, it seems that the one strong binding thing that we have here is the budget committee, and we've all worked together, but it's not as easy. But I think the points you're bringing up are, need to be addressed. We have any more comments?
No, I have a process question. So we're meeting this morning with the goal of trying to vote on some document that will then be discussed tonight. And I think this committee recognizes it would be good for us to have guidelines approved in October. It's better information for the Board of Education. It's better information for the town departments because they've already started their budget process. So I don't want to delay this. I think I've only heard 2 suggestions that have been agreed upon from the current draft from this morning to just presentation issues. I haven't heard any substantive issue, which sounds like it will prevail with the majority of this board. So how do you want to proceed with our actions this morning?
So would you like to make a motion to approve this and get started on the process?
I don't want to make that motion.
Okay.
But somebody else
But
can.
Nisha?
Sure. I can make a motion to approve the budget guidelines for fiscal year 23-24 draft as is in front of us and the relevant exhibits that accompany it.
Would you like to second that motion? No. Laura, would you like to second that motion? Okay, so I will second that motion and bring this to the floor for discussion. Do we have any discussion?
I think we've discussed.
We've just,
Okay, so are we ready to take a vote? I'm not sure. Are we ready to take a vote? Is that what you would like to do, Leslie?
to clarify, I'll do the easy one first. To clarify the agreed-upon change from the draft distributed to committee members before this meeting, on page 3 in Board of Ed Facilities section, we're taking out the parenthetical reference to the source document.
Okay,
We are,
and this is a motion? Or what are we doing here? Or we don't need a motion? We're just going to do it?
I
We're going to
think
do
we can
it?
just do it, and
Okay.
if somebody disagrees, they
No,
can make a
no,
statement.
I think
These are
I'm
more
fine with you.
clarifications
Okay.
than they are substantive changes. We're adding to the list of facilities that there's one alternative high school. And I don't know how we're handling the decline in elementary enrollment. Can we just decide what the approach is now?
Yes.
I think we should confirm the numbers. Roland can be the arbiter, and then they can be inserted for the draft that's posted for tonight, if
Are we-
that's okay.
Are we reflecting K through 5 or pre-K through 5?
I mean, I think if we reflect K through 5, we should have a sentence that says pre-K has gone up by X, which is housed in elementary schools. I mean, I think there should, pre-K cannot,
Because it's a
needs to be
facility
included
comment.
somehow, how we reflect it, I am.
Okay,
indifferent.
so I would suggest,
I'm
if
okay- I'm
if
okay
this
with
is
it.
agreeable, that Nisha and Laura work with Roland and just end up with the final sentence and the final numbers. How's that?
Sure.
Is that okay with you? Okay, so that's how we're going to resolve that one.
Then I would like to offer an amendment. The amendment is to increase the cost for Central Middle School's project as reflected in this document to $85 million.
I'll second.
Moved by Leslie,
I'm sorry, Leslie, can you just repeat that?
seconded by Laura.
To increase the construction cost or the cost for the Central Middle School project from the $67.5 million that's reflected in this document to $85 million. And I guess I should, if I can modify that, that would increase the total capital. Well, let me do it in steps. 'Cause that still may be a
May I
separate
just
motion.
ask a question on that?
Yes.
So I just want to make sure I understand the motion, Leslie. So what you'll be proposing is I'm not sure, are you proposing on the top of page 2 to make that $85 million, and that would still have the parentheses inclusive of construction site work and FF&E, the way the other one does, right?
Yes,
That's the
and-
remaining costs.
And to be,
I mean,
Yeah,
that's all we
that's the
can do
only-
at this point in time. That's all the information that we would have at this point in time, in my, as far as I know.
yeah, so
Leslie.
to change the number from 67.5 to 85.
And,
And it should be inclusive of all soft costs as well as construction, site work, and FF&E, correct?
well, we
Or do
had
you
other
consider
costs
soft costs?
here, but they have an additional $2.5 million, and Leslie actually suggested that that be removed, Laura, so I don't, I will let the two of you
I would
decide that.
actually like the whole parenthetical be removed. It's really the cost going forward for Central Middle School. And when you talk about construction costs, in my mind, that includes the outside experts you may need to facilitate that construction, which are soft costs.
And it also includes FF&E, because that's the way you apply to the state, correct? That's why I think it's good to have the parenthetical there.
Or you could just say all-in costs of Central.
Let's just,
What?
we can vote on the number. I don't know if that really matters. It's a detail.
Why don't we just leave this other here, and they had the other $2.5 million for the soft costs too, Laura?
Can I just make a statement on that? So trying to figure out what I want to say here. I think, Leslie, Miss Moriarty, that you're proposing the $85 million based upon what the Board of Ed has proposed at their capital. I don't think that number is coming from any other insight that you might have on this project other than what the Board of Ed is now feeling that the number should be, which is, I want to say, extremely premature, considering that we haven't even hired the owner's rep at this point. We've just begun to see architect proposals, which supposedly are confidential, but maybe they're not, since it looks like some Board of Ed members are voting on the overall budget. But it appears, again, that we are, again, putting the cart before the horse and deciding to up a budget of a project based upon what the Board of Ed feels the number is, based upon premature estimates that an architect is proposing based upon a scope and size of school that the Board of Ed has proposed, which we just had a discussion that the scope and the size of the school are 30 to 40% larger based upon their own calculation and based upon state guidelines. So I'm just not sure where our true independence is coming in as budget members here, where we are just saying, yep, I'm going to ignore all of those facts and just say, you know what, that's what they want, and that's what we're going to propose to increase. I am shocked to see that despite this conversation, that number is still being proposed. I would be okay if you said, let's see where this goes, and let's see what, how we come out of it. Let's have a discussion with the Board of Ed and say, listen, can we reduce the scope? Let's have an honest discussion. Say, listen, do you think this is too large? But I think the approach is extremely disturbing to me, that we just take whatever the Board of says and we just plop it in here and then hope, we can have a discussion and then we'll have some headlines tomorrow in the paper, one person says this and one person says this. That's not what this is about. Let's try and solve problems there. Let's try and get this project done in an appropriate budget so we can also get other infrastructure projects for our schools done.
And
So can I
respond?
just ask one question first, though?
Sure.
I'm not sure, I think I'm asking it of you, Leslie, but it could be asking of Nisha. These numbers that they're using to come up with $85 million, are they public numbers? Or where do these number $85 million comes from?
So just to clarify, I don't know the source of the numbers, but hang on a second. The Board of Ed has posted its agenda for its meeting on Thursday with its draft capital plan, and the number for Central Middle School is 85.5 million. So I'm assuming that the Board of Ed administration has some basis for those numbers. So while it's not voted on, that is a publicly available document with a newly revised Central Middle School number of 85.5 million.
So Laura, would you want to know the basis of that number increase before you decide to put it into the budget
I absolutely would. I
guidelines?
just looked at this, so I want to look at the backup CIP sheet. I would like to listen to the discussion. So I like your concept of saying, that it is subject to additional, based on new information, it's subject to change.
No, but
I don't know if that's what you're saying.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying you are saying that I would like to increase this number from X to Y because a public entity is telling me what, but I don't know what basis they're using to increase that number. And I will blindly agree to that number because it's the Board of Ed. And I don't
not
understand.
blindly agreeing to
I don't
anything.
really
Back and
understand.
forth, Okay?
All right, well,
But,
I'm
I mean,
just
I've
tit
let
for
back
tat
and
here.
forth, but I would just like to say that we all supported a $70 million Central Middle School when the superintendent and the chair came and talked to us about it. Now, on hearsay or some potential document or whatever, you're asking for a change, when we don't even know the backup. We seem to be, I don't know if these RFP numbers are public. No one has given me any information. Perhaps Nisha has this, but she's on the building committee, and it's probably, it's my understanding that even things like the vote for the owner's rep was in executive session. Okay? So, where is all this coming from? I don't know. But I think we're just going to vote on this.
No, I need
wait a
to
second.
respond.
Okay,
It was my
okay,
motion. I'd
Okay,
like to
Leslie can respond. Leslie can respond, but no more back and forth, just without,
No, the
I've
reason-
allowed it to some degree, but, this was a stop.
The reason I made this motion, and I appreciate the opportunity to justify why I made this motion, is I want the conversations to continue about the building, what's needed in the building, what the cost of what those needs are. But what I'm hearing from my committee members here is that there's no real conversation. The 67.5 is a cap, and that concerns me. I cannot keep, especially since the Board of Ed has now published a number that they believe the number is 85 million. I don't know what the answer is, but if we're going to set guidelines with a $100 million capital budget cap and Central Middle is at 67.5, you're asking me to approve a number or a budget and a fixed cap to construct something that I don't know if it meets the needs of the community, of the students, of the site, and what can be built for that number. So while you're saying, while it's been said that the 85 million is an overly generous number, I have no idea if that's overly generous. I don't know if 67 million is overly generous. And the way our process works is we usually give ourselves time and an ability to modify the estimates as the projects move forward, and I'm not hearing there's any of that in this process. This process has turned into a cap. This is the maximum level, is what I've heard my fellow members say they're willing to spend on this project. And I can't agree to that based on the information I have. So I'm making the motion to increase the dollar amount to the new information that the Board of Ed, which has not vetted it, which hasn't but it's posted on their website, to move it to $85 million, because that's the latest information we have, and I think that's what's appropriate for this board to consider.
So I'll make one more comment before we vote. The language does not say this is a cap. Many people have used the budget guidelines, as a cap. No one goes below the number that I see. It's rare that we see anyone coming in below the number on anything. So what the guidelines say is expected to cover Central Middle School at the additional current estimated project cost of $67.5 million. And it does say inclusive of construction, site work, and FF&E. GHS remediation, we don't have any numbers there, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we have talked about lower, but we also know that numbers, construction, et cetera, has been increasing costs. I don't know by the time they go out to bid where it's going to be. And we've always been flexible to absorb realistic changes in the marketplace. We've seen in our own current calendar year 22, 25% increases approved by this budget committee for Eastern Greenwich Civic Center, for the senior center, and for the GEMS building. And they're all approximately that amount. This is a guideline of what the information we've had. The superintendent has not come back to this committee. People can go talk with her. People can have her invite her to the next budget committee meeting, only to talk about this. Or people can go and do it behind the, as we do for many liaison or other meetings. But it says additional current estimated project costs. There's a lot of work to be done, as you've just pointed out, so I'm going to call this for a vote. Okay, so those in favor of Leslie's motion to increase the additional current estimated project cost of $67.5 million, inclusive of construction site work and FF&E for Central Middle School. Those in favor of this motion? So voting yes are Laura and Leslie. Those against? So that motion has failed. Thank you. Do you have any more motions?
Yes, I'd like to make another amendment to increase the capital estimate for fiscal '24 to $125 million,
To what?
125.
I'm sorry. You,
Increase the.
what page are we on? Can you just identify?
It's throughout the document. So the targeted capital for fiscal '24.
Right.
It shows on page 1, on page 2, on the attachment, Exhibit 1, and in the capital section, to change the $100 million number to 125. And my rationale is that when Central Middle School comes in, it will be a higher number, and I don't want other maintenance projects to be squeezed out of the budget.
I'll second that motion.
Okay, so seconded by Laura. Have you just given your explanation, or would you like to talk
I
more
have.
to support your motion?
That's my explanation.
Okay. So, I just say that, I think that we've all worked together in the past, and I think that, this number reflects what we know that the town is capable of doing at this point in time. So I'll call this for a vote. Oh, Nisha, I'm sorry.
I just want to, for public record, make the comment that the justification being provided for the additional 25 million capital tax is to accommodate an additional 20 million or so that potentially could be, could potentially be the additional cost of Central Middle if we were to accept the current proposals. Again, I think that's inappropriate, considering we are building 40% larger. And I'm saying this over and over again because I do want this board to make sure that we do our job, that when we have projects in front of us that are considerably larger, out of scope, out of budget, we put our budget hats on and say, listen, let's get this budget in check, instead of accepting it and just increasing the overall spending. So I think it's an inappropriate ask because for all the reasons I've already stated several times now.
Okay. So those in favor of the motion by Leslie to change the $100 million to 125, and you said it's in 3 locations, Leslie? Is that what you said? Well, it would be in every location where we find
Wherever
it.
it's,
Okay?
right, yeah.
Those in favor? And those against? So that motion has failed. 2-0.
Another motion?
Yes.
to increase the estimate for capital tax levy to $3 million. Estimate the increase in capital tax levy to $3 million from the $1.5 million currently in Exhibit 1.
So your motion is to increase the proposed capital tax levy of $1.5 million by another $1.5 million to $3 million,
Right.
correct?
Yes.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
The rationale, just very quickly, is that we do have a capital plan that we do need to fund. I think there are going to be increasing demands if we fund even a significant portion of what's being requested to us. We've traditionally, as a board, targeted a $3 million annual increase in the capital tax levy. The past few years, we haven't always done that. And the cost of construction, as Ms. Tarkington just identified, is increasing with inflation, with building products that may abate at some point in the future. But we need to plan to fund our capital budget. This particular line item is not the current year capital. It's not even the current bond amount that we're expected to go to the market for in January. It's for that 5-10-year capital number, and it would put us in better stead for addressing capital needs by increasing it the full $3 million.
So I'll just add here that in our previous version of the budget guidelines, we had multiple reasons why we weren't considering capital tax levy increase in this particular budget guidelines. We wanted more information to come in February. We know that we've moved about $7 million of items from capital to operating, and we're going to continue that program to the extent it's needed, where we need to make accounting changes for that. Our debt issuance over the next couple of years is pretty flat. We're, operating behind our schedule for construction, et cetera. So at this point in time, until we have more refined numbers in February, I think that you had suggested in some information to us that we increase that capital tax levy by $1 million, and we came back and said we'll actually increase it by $1.5 million. I think that we have really worked to address what we also recognize will be a rising need if we not only approve this number of $400 million for the 5-year capital, but if it is actually executed and the projects in the pipeline are executed. So that's my opinion at this point in time. Are there any other comments? So I will take a vote on this. Leslie?
I vote in favor.
Laura?
Yes.
Nisha?
No.
And I'm a no, so that motion also has failed. Are we ready to take a vote on the?
I have two other motions. I know how they're going to fall out in the vote, but I do think I want to get them on the record. Sorry, Leslie. One is the first one, which is probably the first one is the 5-year capital number. I would like to recommend that number from 400 to 475. I think it's more reflective of the information we have at hand.
Is there a second?
Second.
So moved by Leslie Moriarty and seconded by Laura Erickson. Any comment? I think we talked about this before. So those in favor
Aye.
and those opposed? Nisha and me. Leslie, so that motion has failed.
And one last motion, and referred to it in my comments before, and that is the challenge budget concept that we have in here is really a underlying approach in the guidelines, and so I'm not going to modify the approach. I am going to rely on the word guideline and not cap as we go forward through the budget process, and I'll remind you of that word guideline as we talk. But I do think the methodology for a higher challenge for the Board of Education versus the town departments, I'm not sure there's sufficient backup for that. Right now, as we said, the town departments are being, their challenge is a 1.2% reduction. The Board of Ed reduction is a 1.5%. And I think that stems from the fact that the Board of Ed staffing is higher, and so there's a higher percentage of reduction expected to come from the staffing changes. And I think it would be a fairer presentation if the total challenge number, which we have for the town, which is at 1.4%, is the same reduction used for both the town and the Board of Education departments. So I can provide the numbers if this motion happens to passes. It's about $350,000 that shifts, that the Board of Ed savings would be 2.4 approximately, and the town's requested savings goes to about 2.1 million.
So can I please clarify this? So you're just proposing that, that you're proposing a change in the challenge for a reduction of 1.4% for both the town and the Board of Education. Is that another way of rewording it, but still have exactly the same motion? But you can change this if you want to.
Yes,
I'm
still
just wanting to
having-
make sure we have the right motion.
Still going with what you're proposing of a $4.4 million reduction for the town's overall operating budget. I think that's aggressive, but I'm not going to, I don't think we're going to have an extensive debate to come to a 2-2 vote on that, but I do think the allocation of that should be split differently. Rather than more from the schools and less from the town, it should be, that should be borne equally. The number for the town turns out to be $1,840,000, and the schools is $2,586,000. But I think the concept can be understood to vote on it without the precise number.
Okay. Again, I just point out that even after the challenge, the department operating costs after the challenge, the town goes up, and after benefits, town goes up 3.12%, and the schools goes up 3.47% without teacher benefits, pension benefits, I want to be specific. There's certainly their health benefits are in there. And and prior to that, town goes up 2% and schools goes up 2.90, almost 50%, whatever. So I just think we'll take this a vote if we have no further
I'll
comment.
second the motion.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you had already. I just clarified it, but that's fine. Thank you, Laura. Okay, so those in favor of Leslie's motion?
Aye.
Those against Leslie's motion? Those abstaining from Leslie's motion? So that vote is 1, 2, 1, and that motion has failed.
Can I just offer my explanation for my abstention, if you don't mind?
Of course.
This is really sausage making, and I don't know what led to these numbers or this, what was behind the scenes. I'm not privy to those discussions, so it seems very arbitrary, so I'm just abstaining because I just don't have the factual backup for the numbers.
Happy to go through how it was done, and if you don't have to do it.
That would be great. Thank you.
I have no further amendment.
You have no further amendments, okay. Nisha, do you have any amendments? Laura, do you have any other amendments?
I have a question for you, Leslie.
I'm sorry?
So I have a question for you. You had talked about how, these are expected to be guidelines, and we always have further discussions, in-depth lengthy discussions with department heads, starting at the end of January and February. But my concern is, we've been down this road before. We've had conversations about trying to increase the capital tax levy during decision days and to plan for the future, and it hasn't worked. I'm concerned about the conversation, very concerned about the conversation we've had today on Central Middle School. And, for the record, I don't rubber stamp anything. I expect rigorous analysis behind projects. But it looks like keeping the same scope, the construction cost is now estimated closer to 700 a square foot versus 600 a square foot, which was the original estimate. I don't think anyone should be too surprised by that. In light of the comments that you made about, this being treated as a guideline, would you like to offer any additional language on Central to that effect?
I would say that it does say additional current estimated project costs. I guess you could say a guideline of 60, I don't know whether Nisha would agree with this, but would you agree that cost a guideline of $67.5 million?
Sorry, what are we, which,
On page 2 of 6.
I'm wondering if you have any flexibility to recognize that the 67.5 million may not be the final number. It's basically the essence of my question.
I mean, again, the
Hopefully
numbers
it's
that
less,
came,
I would say.
let me just finish. I'll come back to you, I'm sorry. But the number presented, the superintendent and the chair of the BOE came to us in this February, March period. It's right on the border there with numbers and whatever. If you remember, it was kind of, they came back. So it was probably March. And so no one has come back to us, Laura. No one has really given us information. Hearsay. Oh, gee, it's gone to $85 million. All this is hearsay. There's no substance number, et cetera, et cetera. The BOE can vote, but look, I think that we all can work together. And quite frankly, we have things on our budget like old business and new business. If there's a topic that you would like or an issue that you think should be addressed with further detail prior to getting to those meetings so that we can be better prepared in those meetings, suggest it. I'm pretty open in terms of what we do. And I think you know me, we've worked together before on MISA and other things, that I like facts and, to be rational. But I also think that we all need to remember that we're in a very tough environment. We can't just project our current environment, but we're in a very tough environment in terms of the rising inflation rate on our taxpayers, in terms of, the impact that they all, and by the way, me and all of us on this board are feeling with all the rest of these utility costs rising at each time. Roland and Pete and I go fill up our automobiles, all of us with gasoline, et cetera. Some of us have an electric car, but whatever. So I just think that, we all need to work together on this, and we will be. But I think that, the rationale for increasing, expanding it so much, it still in my opinion, needs discussion. You can't just, do something without putting all the facts out there. And quite frankly, I think the Prada, however you pronounce the name, study should have been out there for everyone to see and talk about. And since Leslie asked for it, I assume that not everyone, it was out there as much, as an example. But, bringing things out, discussion, details, bringing it to light. Nisa's on the building committee. We can have her give a report to the budget committee and have others come, whatever it is that you want. I'm open to discussions. I mean, we've worked together. Nisha, I don't know if you have any comments on that?
I think the only point I have not made today on Central, I don't want to keep repeating myself, is, one of the things that we as a community really strive for is sustainability and environmental sustainability. And one of the most important components of that is energy efficiency and capacity utilization. So again, we always want to focus on when we are talking about sizing of these projects, that our capacity utilization is high. So when we build programs that are larger, more space than is required, then we, by definition, are going to have underutilized programs. That's going to have more maintenance, more energy, and simply is just not great for the environment. The overall trend, macro, both for school infrastructure and municipal infrastructure, is to build more compact and more concise. That's a lot of the legislation that is actually being supported from the current administration. So this idea that we are Greenwich and we will build bigger and 30-40% larger because we can is just a falsehood. I think we really need, the reason that it's really important to put a reasonable number in this is because people get anchored to that. So as soon as we put in 60 million or whatever the number it is, all of our bids came in at 60. As soon as we put 84, all of our bids are going to come in at 84. But the current proposed project, I'm very confident will get done under this budget if we scope and size this project appropriately. Again, appropriately doesn't mean it has to be for 450 students. It doesn't mean it has to be for 500. It needs to be an appropriate cushion that we all as a community can agree with. But the 30 to 40% cushion on this project is simply not appropriate. So if we just shave the scope 20%, 30%, we're going to be right within budget, even with current inflationary costs of supply and material. So I think we can do it. I think we can work together to do it. I certainly hope that we as a BET put our budget hats on and encourage the Board of Ed to get this project within scope. And I agree with Ms. Moriarty. Let's do that today versus a year from now, so we don't waste the time not only of the building committee but of our stall this project beyond, because this is not going to get, this project does not have my support at the size that it's being proposed.
So, I will add one other point here. Even without this discussion, I am not sure this is being built or would move ahead on the timeline we originally discussed in this March period, February-March period. I think from what I can see or what feedback I get in terms of where we are, the timeline, we're at minimum 6 months behind that timeline. But that's my comment. But I've also talked with the chair, and, he has supplied, the same kind of information. I don't know, and I don't want this, if this comes to the Budget Committee and it's ready, then this is the right thing to do this year. But, it may or may not, I know that the BOE is approving this larger amount. But the question is will this really be a fiscal year 24 project? I think it is right now. I'm not questioning that at all, so I don't want that to be used against me. But I just don't know. I think that we all need to think about this in this group of discussions that Leslie thinks we need to have earlier than later, and that includes, in my opinion, the realistic time frame and timeline for the project itself. So I'm throwing that out there. It's not to be difficult. It's not saying that I'm against this and budget guidelines or anything else. It's just another thing when you're talking about discussions about this, we can't forget the time frame and whether this will end up being a fiscal year 24 project or a fiscal year 25 project. And if it comes and it's ready, I've said before, and I'll say again, I will be supporting it.
Just don't forget the state bonding calendar when we look at this.
No, it's
So
not, it's not
it's
me.
all of
They
it.
have to be ready and they have to apply. So I agree with all those
I
things.
think we've been here now almost
Okay.
2 hours. Let's just vote and move on.
Okay. So we already have a motion on the floor, moved by Nisha and seconded by me. So those in favor of the budget guidelines? Nisha and me? Okay. Those against? Laura and Leslie. So that's a 2-2 vote, and that motion does not pass. So is
I
there,
move to adjourn.
so 10:50?
I'll second.
moved by Leslie, seconded by Laura. Excuse me. Seconded by Nisha. Those in favor? 400.